Hi, this is Jerry Borrowman. I appreciate the invitation to speak on this blog today. I thought I'd talk about the first book I wrote, which was published in 1989, and then a few minutes on the most recent that will come out in June of 2025. My first book is entitled Three Against Hitler, and I wrote it with Rudi Wobbe, who lived the experiences. He and two of his best friends at church grew up in the era in which the Nazis came to power. By the time they were teenagers, Nazi Germany was at war with France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. They became convinced that this regime led by Adolf Hitler was evil. And so they started a modest resistance effort in their hometown of Hamburg to try to persuade people not to support the government. The leader of the group was a young man by the name of Helmut Hubener, and he had a very high IQ. He was a brilliant boy who, when he was called to stand before the Supreme Court of Germany, was told by the Chief Justice that an essay he'd written would have received an A+ if he'd been a law school student. He wrote that when he was in the 8th grade. The person I wrote the book with, Rudi Wobbe, was his younger friend, and they were joined by Karl-Heinz Schnibbe in this effort. What would happen is Helmut would listen to broadcasts of the British Broadcasting Corporation, which was illegal under German law. He'd take extensive notes of what was being said as the BBC gave an accurate reporting of the war, and then he would use a church typewriter to write these pamphlets or handbills using carbon paper. Not too many people remember carbon paper anymore, but that would allow him to make multiple copies at a time. Rudi and Karl-Heinz would then go and put these in public places on bulletin boards, even at the opera, slipping them into the pockets of opera goers who were in watching the show. And these they did tell the truth about what was happening. Of course, it was an ill-fated effort. The Gestapo became very concerned because Hamburg was a working-class city and they didn't want to have any unrest. Eventually, they were able to find out who was behind these pamphlets. They arrested the three boys plus another, Gerhard Duver, and they interrogated and tortured them. It was a very difficult ordeal to go through. Ultimately, Rudi and Karl-Heinz were sentenced to prison. Helmut was condemned to death for the crime of preparation to high treason. And so Three Against Hitler is a very dramatic story, a true story. It was Rudi's autobiography and something that he felt very strongly about. We wrote the book. It took us 3 years. We submitted it to 22 publishers nationwide, and we were rejected by all of them. I was the one who sent those in and eventually became discouraged. A year passed, and then Rudi called me one day. He had met Elie Wiesel, the famed Nazi hunter who had been imprisoned during World War II, and he told him his story and was told, "You've got to publish this." So Rudi came back to me and he said, "Jerry, what are we going to do about the book?" And I said, "Rudi, I don't know. I've tried everything I can think of. Maybe people just aren't buying this kind of book anymore." He said, "That's not good enough. This story needs to be told." So I was a little aggravated, but I gave the book to my wife, Marcella, to read, and to a friend of ours, Darren Rodriguez, who had recently had a book published, and asked if they'd look through it for suggestions. Now, it surprises me how naive I was back then. Today, I always put books out to readers to get their feedback before submitting it to my publisher. But they came back with some great suggestions. When Marcella started, I said, "Would you use a red pen when you got want to cross out a word or something so I can see it more easily?" And she said, "Sure." Well, when she handed me the manuscript back and I saw the first page, I said, "Did you have a bloody nose?" It was just covered in red. What we figured out from that is that Rudi and I both loved history, and so we'd written the book in a way that we tried to set the stage by going back into World War I and talking about the heavy reparations levied against Germany. And that was not interesting. It wasn't a great way to start the story. So they suggested we start right where the action began in Rudi's life. We cut out the first, about 70% of the first chapter, submitted it to Covenant Communications, and they accepted it for publication. It was a very poignant moment because Rudi desperately wanted the story to be told of his best friend from childhood, and we get this message that they're going to publish it. I went over to Rudi's house. He, at that point in his life, was suffering from cancer. He'd been up at the University of Utah Hospital for treatments, and I would make photocopies of the manuscript that he passed out to doctors and nurses because he felt so strongly about this. We signed the contract, and 1 week later, Rudi passed away. So he never got to see the book, but he did know that it was going to be published. Well, that book went on to become a bestseller, and it sort of launched my career because people love the story, they love the bravery of these young men, and it was such a great opportunity. It's interesting, just sort of a fun story. I submitted the title before the Blood Tribunal. That's what the German people called this Supreme Court that had been instituted to suppress political dissent, because everybody who went there was likely to lose their life or suffer. The book sold about 6,000 copies in the first 18 months, which was a very good rate for a new book and unknown authors. But the sales had started to taper off, so I thought it was coming to the end of its life. My publisher, Covenant Communications, came and said, we're going to republish this, but we want to change the title. And so they came up with the title 3 Against Hitler. In the next 6 months, it sold an additional 18,000 copies and is continuously in print for now 35 years. What we figured out is that the word blood put people off. They were unsure what it was going to be about, whereas 3 Against Hitler gave perfect clarity to it. It was such an honor to help Rudi tell this important story. And that gave me the chance to learn how to do co-authored biographies. I went on to write a book with Joseph Banks called A Distant Prayer. He was a flight engineer on a B-17 bomber in World War II, who on his 49th combat mission, his aircraft was destroyed by friendly fire. The lead aircraft lost power just as they were dropping their bombs, and those bombs fell on Joe's plane. The story has miraculous events that saved his life and allowed him to share the story, and it's now my bestseller. I then was able to help write a book with Bernie Fisher, published by my current publisher, Shadow Mountain. Bernie won the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's correctly called the Medal of Honor for bravery above and beyond the call of duty for his service in Vietnam, when he went at great peril to his own life to rescue a downed airman who had been shot by the North Vietnamese. Well, that started my career. Since then, I've been fortunate to have a total of 22 books published commercially. And it's just such a joy to me to have people that enjoy reading these stories as much as I enjoy researching them. I'm a little unique in the sense that half of my books are nonfiction. They're true stories, either co-authored biography with men like Bernie and Joe and Rudi, or they're a compilation of stories. The other half of my books are fiction, and mostly historical fiction. That gives me a chance to tell a story that I think is important, but using characters that come from my own imagination. And, people love true stories, of course, but the reason many people love historical fiction is that you're able to go into the mind of the characters, whereas in a biography, you don't get to do that. And that brings me to what's happening now. Much to my surprise, a book that I wrote and really enjoyed creating is not in my typical genre. Rather, it's a political thriller set in 1910. It tells the story of Jason Ellis, who was a senator from New York State, who was also great friends with Theodore Roosevelt. In that era, there was a worldwide phenomenon called the anarchist movement. Today, we would call them terrorists, who were committed to destroying governments around the world and replacing them with worker-led collectives, so that we might call it socialism today, but fully implemented, not sort of free enterprise along with social benefits that we enjoy, rather a full collective ownership by the populace. Well, the anarchists assassinated world leaders. They made an attempt on the life of Queen Victoria, on the life of her son, the Prince of Wales. They assassinated the King of Spain. The anarchist movement killed William McKinley, president, and that's what brought Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. So in this story, I talk about that by having Ellis become the target of a group who wants to kill him to create a sensation. Plus, it's also got a personal grudge from one of the people he knew on Wall Street. That's where my character, Senator Ellis, made his fortune. So it creates a great deal of intrigue. I've been so pleased by the response of early readers, some who say this is the best story you've ever told. Well, I think the true stories are more important, but this one captures a moment in time that most Americans are not familiar with, and it gave me a chance to amp up the kind of tension I'm able to create in a story. So I hope when the book comes out, it's called Flames of Anarchy, and when it's released in June, I hope that readers look forward to reading it and that they enjoy it, and hopefully share that on social media, reviews on the various websites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Deseret Book, Shadow Mountain. And I just hope that it becomes a book that people really enjoy and say, I learned something from that in the form of an enjoyable story. So to all of you who have read my books in the past and enjoyed them, thank you for your loyalty. It just means the world to me to have people who share my passion for history. And I hope that you might reach out to me through my website, jerryborrowman.com. Share your thoughts as you read the books. I'd look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again to Shadow Mountain for giving me this time, and see you soon.